So,
Hi, good morning or good afternoon or good evening to everyone wherever you are following us from in the world. I'm very pleased to chair a Journal Population Economics session with a fantastic lineup of presenters of papers that were recently published in the journal. This gives you a flavor of the type of work that we publish in the journal and an opportunity to engage with the authors and ask them all kinds of tough questions after they present. So we have 5 speakers today with us. And each speaker will have 15 minutes for the presentation and about 5 minutes for questions afterwards. I ask everybody who is not speaking to mute their microphones and to reserve their questions for after the presentation. Or you can type your questions in the chat and I can read them out afterwards. And before we get started, I should also say who I am. My name is Milena Nikolova. I am a professor in the economics of well-being at the University of Groningen, and most importantly, one of the editors of the Journal of Population Economics. Now, without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, who is Alain Trannoy. So without further ado, please take it away.
so hello, everybody. Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to present this paper, which is a joint paper with Tanguy Le Fur from University of Lille. And it focuses on trying to offer another explanation on what we call the American health puzzle. We know that despite healthcare expenditure, which is higher than in most advanced economies, the Americans suffer from a health gap regarding many indicators, many health indicators. And so here we want to focus on maybe the potential role of the fact that the Americans work more than, for example, the European. And in fact, we help to try to uh, focus on the new concept, which will be the health maximizing level of labor supply, which had a sense in a macro model. And here I will go through the presentation by following the suggested outline by looking first at the issues, the innovation, and the major findings. So, as I already told, the American health proposal is the fact that less healthy, the Americans are less healthy despite larger health expenditure comparative with other advanced economies. For example, if you look at the life expectancy at 65, the US is ranked at the 28th rank in OECD countries. And when we look at an indicator of prevalence of chronic diseases, then it is ranked at the 35th. So very bad rank. And so we are not, it is quite uncommon to see the Americans at very bad ranking like that for other dimension. So there have been many explanations. Opioid has been one of the explanation. Greater cost of healthcare, larger inequality in many dimensions. The fact also that there is less public healthcare insurance than, for example, in Europe. And here we want to focus on a complementary explanation, which is maybe what we call excess labor. And in fact, this idea has been foreseen by Adam Smith's The Wealth of Nations. Here the sentence: mutual emulation and desire for greater gain prompt workers to overwork themselves and to hurt their health by excessive labor. So there are a large literature which has proved that there is a detrimental effect of long working hours on health. For example, the fact that you have fewer vacation days, strange hours during night or weekend, long commuting time, etc. And in fact, there is the following observation is key for our mechanism. It is the fact that at the beginning of the 80s, Americans and Europeans work the same number of hours, about 1800 during a year. 30 years later, Europeans work less and Americans are working as much as they did in the 80s. So, in fact, the Americans still work about 200 or 300 more than the European over a year. And so we can think that it is true for every year during a career of, let's say, 30, 35 years, it can make a difference, for example, in the life expectancy for the workers, for the age group of 50, 55, 64. So now I turn to the innovation that we introduce. So here we have both innovation from a theoretical viewpoint and a quantitative aspect. From a theoretical viewpoint, in fact, our main idea was to introduce health capital à la Grossman, which is a famous paper in EGP in 1972, to introduce this concept of health capital in the neoclassical growth model with elastic labor supply. So it is a representative agent model. And so we propose two specifications for this health capital. And so here you have two equations here on this slide. And it says that the growth of the degrowth of health capital across time is made of two parts. So it is a separable functions. There is a depreciation rate here, which is a minus term. So this depreciation rate in the first formulation is endogenous and is depend on L. L is the labor supply, the number of hours work. And so in the first specification, the health depreciation rate is endogenous, while in the second equation, you have a constant health depreciation rate. And the first part is about what we can be the recurring function of health, which depend on the medical care, M, lower capital M. And in the second specification, this recurring function depend on leisure. So another ingredient of this neoclassical growth model is the version of the utility. Here, the utility function depends on three terms, which is the consumption, the health status, H, and the labor supply, L. And here in the first specification, it is a standard log linear function of leisure, health, and consumption, while in the second specification, we introduce, it is here the term here in red, we introduce the fact that there is a complementarity between leisure and consumption, meaning that the marginal utility of consumption is increasing with leisure. And so here the crucial parameter is the parameter phi here, which is the preference here for leisure. So what we do, we established the property of the steady state equilibrium for three variants of the model, which combine assumption on health capital and preferences. We have analytical result because we can solve the result in a closed form, and we offer some comparative static result, and then we calibrate the model comparing the US Great Britain and France economy. So regarding now, I turn to the major findings of the paper first regarding analytical result. So we are able to express all macro variables in function of labor supply, which is itself dependent from preferences for leisure, the parameter phi. So in fact, there is a monodic relation between labor supply and phi, of course, increasing or decreasing. And we are able to prove, according to some conditions, which prove that are true in the calibration, the existence and unicity of the steady state. And then at the steady state, we look at some comparative static result, and we prove first that the share of health expenditures decreases with preferences for leisure, the parameter phi, in 2 cases out of 3. And so are able in some sense to reproduce one part of the American result, the fact that the US is working more, the fact that the healthcare share in the GDP is higher in the US than in Europe. And second, here our main concept that is here the health maximizing labor supply, and here it is illustrated by this following figure. So here in the horizontal axis, you have here the labor supply at this steady state, which depend on phi, the parameter of preferences for labor or for leisure. And on the vertical axis, you have the health status at the steady state. And in fact, the main discovery that we have is that this curve is M-shaped. So you have here a maximum, and before you have a situation before and situation after, which are different. So before this L bar, when you in the society people are working more, because they are working more, they can buy more medical care, and this additional medical care is able to offset and to more than offset the depreciation of health induced by this additional hours of work. While when we are beyond L bar, it is the opposite. You are working more, you are still able to buy more medical care, but it is not enough to compensate for the deterioration of health status due to the additional hours of work. So it is really our main concept, and it is in fact country specific. It depends on all the parameters of the economy. So to sum up our theoretical findings, here considering our 3 versions, V1, V2, V3, homothétic preferences plus endogenous depreciation, homothétic preferences plus exogenous depreciation, or non-homothétic preferences plus exogenous depreciation. So 3 models, 3 specifications. So able to prove the existence and unicity of the steady state, decreasingness of the share of GDP devoted to health expenditure with respect to preferences for leisure in 2 cases over 3, and then the M-shape of health maximizing labor supply. So regarding now the quantitative exercise, we take the model to the data to quantify the part of the American puzzle due to the differences in preference for leisure. First, we calibrate the model to replicate the US data. And here we make use of a remarkable study by Blundell, Bozio, and Larocque in 2012 and 11, where they really compare on the same basis what are the differences between intensive margin labor supply in the US, Great Britain, and France. So we use different health indicator, mortality rate, limitation of daily life activity, prevalence of heart disease. And the bottom line is that first, the gap in working hours explained between 10% and 1/3 of the health gap and half of the expenditure gap. Just to give you a sense of the result, here you have a copy of the table of result for the baseline. And in the baseline, we have first calibrate the model to the American data. And so we ask what will be the impact in the counterfactual, what if Americans work as much as Europeans? So they will work less. So here in the first column, you have here the share of total time devoted to labor time in the UK and France. And in fact, we recalibrate the parameter phi in the US economy in order that the US will work as much as in the UK case or in the French case. Here, L bar, L tilde here is health maximizing labor supply. And so here you have first the result regarding the share of healthcare. So about 3 points in reduction of healthcare expenditure in proportion of the GDP. And here regarding the effect on health, you have about between 600 and 700 less deaths per 100,000 people. So there is a lot of robustness checks accounting for the differences in healthcare price, accounting for the variation in the curvature of depreciation. We use as other indicators of health status, and we also show that the results are robust if we make the counterfactual, the reverse counterfactual exercise. What if the Europeans work as much as Americans? So just for the perspective, I will end up with this slide. So our model can be used also explain part of the trend to a better health in the end of the 20th and the previous century in developed countries, because there is a decrease in the labor supply. And also part of the trend also can be explained to a better health when emerging countries become advanced economies, among many other factors: sanitation, healthcare access, better medication. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm very keen to hear your questions.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. I'd like to open it up for questions from the audience. Please unmute your microphone and ask your question. So maybe I can ask you, you mentioned that you did the other counterfactual exercise. So what if the Americans work like the Europeans? And by Europeans here, you mean the French and the British,
and
right?
UK, yeah, because we we focus on these two countries because we have very good data of labor supply on the intensive margin. So it is really on comparable basis for US, UK, and France. And it is a tricky comparison. And so we don't have this, let's say, comparison on the same basis for other European countries with respect to the US. So it is why we favor here this comparison.
And what happens then if the Europeans work like the British and the French?
If the
like you said that you did a second counterfactual exercise.
Yeah,
where...
the counterfactual, and in fact,
Yeah.
and we show that there will be a deterioration of the of the health status for British people and French people, and an increase also in the healthcare expenditure share in the GDP. Okay, because the main point is to show that where are you with respect to this figure about the health maximizing well, what are our situation with respect to the health maximizing labor supply? In fact, we show that in US, in France, in the UK, we are on the right of the health maximizing labor supply. So it means that if we if you work more, it means that you will expend more in healthcare, and at the same time the health status of your population will deteriorate.
Klaus Zimmermann?
Yeah, a quick question of understanding. One issue was hours worked, the other was preferences, and you brought in the preferences. You change preferences in the utility function. What is the relationship between preferences and workload for the results? What is more important?
So what is very important? So the parameter phi is
What
not
is more
so
important?
much
What is more important? Is it preferences really making the difference, or working habits? I mean, well, both is related a bit, I understand, but preferences.
So here we have only the parameter phi capture all what the preferences for leisure, for all the preferences for leisure, and we have the preferences for health. So here, if I come back to the utility function, you have phi here, which is preference for leisure. Here, 1 minus 5 for this first block. In this first block, you have here a nu, which is a parameter for preferences for consumption, and 1 minus u, which is a preferences for health. But in fact, this parameter is not so important for our result. Which are much more important here is let's say, the specification of the function of recovering function here, which depend on medical care, and here medical care and leisure, and here the formulation, the specification here for the dependence of the health depression rate with respect to working hours. So here these the main parameters here which matter are really this curvature. So the deterioration of health and the recovering effect of health due to medical care, which matter a lot for the result, for the quantitative result, I mean.
Okay, thank you very much. That's helpful to understand. Okay.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, that's the only time we have for a discussion. This doesn't do justice to the paper, so please, whoever is interested, go ahead and read it. Thank you very much for this nice
presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and thank you very much for this initiative that is well appreciated by the author of this paper and probably all the authors of Journal Population Economics. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. So I'd like to now invite Alexander Kritikos to share his presentation. So we're switching topics a little bit. So Alexander, you have 15 minutes. Please take it away. Yes.
Yes, thank you very much. This is indeed now a completely different topic, I admit. So I will talk now about the gender pay gap and the question whether the gender of firm ownership matters for the gender pay gap. This is joint work with the Finnish colleagues, Mika Maliranta, Vera Nipala, and Satu Nurmi. And as you will see in a second why, it's simply Finnish data. That is what brought us together. Let me give you a short motivation. There is a huge literature on the gender pay gap. As we all know, over the last decades, it has been found that the gap is decreasing, but it is still there's still a relevant gap in the world around. And there's one branch or one strand of literature which focuses on the gender composition in firm management, and it's argued that this may also be relevant for the gender pay gap. So why? Well, female superiors might be motivated to reduce this gap to the extent that it is rooted in discriminatory practices. Now, if we look on this research so far, which has happened on this very specific strand of literature, this research finds small effects when comparing firms dominated by female managers with firms dominated by male managers, or when there is a switch from a male to a female manager. Now, what has not been investigated so far at all, so we are, I believe, basically the first ones, we look into female entrepreneurs and female business owners and want to know whether, as they have different access to organizational power, they have more skin in the game, and they can, in particular in small firms, decide about wages directly with their employees, whether there is a different kind of gender pay gap reduction when we focus on female entrepreneurs, female business owners. Now, just to give you in this short amount of time a very brief theoretical background, when can the gender of the firm owner or entrepreneur matter? Simply when there is some kind of explicit or implicit discrimination where women in particular confront unconscious or unintentional bias, where male managers are somehow inclined to support or promote male more strongly than female managers. If that's the case, then the gender of the owner or the gender of the manager may matter. Could also be, of course, explicit discrimination, but this is, at least in the Western economies, forbidden. It may still exist, what we don't know. Now, having the ability is, of course, the necessary condition to reduce the gender pay gap by female entrepreneurs, female owners. But of course, it's not a sufficient condition. And this makes us, of course, also look into what factors may influence this willingness of female entrepreneurs to reduce this gender pay gap by maybe introducing gender-neutral wages or even creating new wage inequalities. So when we look into this research, there are basically two lines. The one line argues that there are homophilous preferences, which leads in this case to common interests between female superiors, in this case female entrepreneurs and female workers, as much as it does between male entrepreneurs and male workers. Contrary to this, there's the principal agent relationship approach, which says there is absolutely no reason for counterfactual for homophilous preferences, rather counteracts this homophilous preferences. There are also other factors on which we do not look, which may influence the gender pay gap, namely, for instance, differing negotiation behavior of male and female employees. But for this analysis, we skip this part. In the sake of time, I will not go so much into these two parts, what, so to say, is what speaks for the willingness to reduce the gap or does not speak for this willingness, but switch directly to the previous empirical evidence. So what we know so far from when we compare male with female managers, we observe that there are two ways of analyzing this. In the one kind of analysis, like I said before, researchers investigate the change from a male to a female manager. And what they find, some of them find that there is a 1.2 to 1.5 percentage points reduction in the gender pay gap from this change. Other researchers, Srivastava chairman and Flabi et al., they observe that there is, if there is this change from a male to a female manager, that there is no effect on the gender pay gap. And the interesting thing here is, and I will come back later to this again, these two researchers look into industries which are heavily dominated by male employees, male employers. So it might be the fact that when we look into the gender pay gap, that the industry may matter where we investigate, so to say, a change from a male to a female manager. In the second line of previous research on managers, people simply compare firms run mostly by male managers with firms mostly by female managers. And again, very much depending on whether there are also film fixed effects used, the observed reduction in the gender pay gap ranges between 1.2 percentage points in those analyses with firm fixed effects to 2.4% in those early analyses where basically between firm comparisons were done and no firm fixed effects were included. So this clarifies our research question. We want to investigate what role the gender of the entrepreneur business owners plays in the wages paid to female employees relative to male employees. And we would like to account for industry of firms because there is obviously differences between industries. And as we will see later, it is also, of course, important to account for firm size because an owner, of course, has maybe more influence on the wages paid to the employees in small firms versus large firms where there might be between the owner and the employees, there might also be managers. Now, what data do we use? I will shortly go through these different data. Basically, the important thing is we use data from 2006 to 2015, simply because then some of these data were stopped to be collected in the Finnish sector, and we exclude certain sectors. And in order to be able to do this analysis, we need information, so to say, on the hourly wages paid to the employees. We need information on the gender of the employees and on their education, the family background, which are offered by these very rich data in the Finnish statistics offices. We also need information that allows us to link the ownership information of the employers to the firms and the employees. And for that, we use FLOWN and the patent and registration statistics, the Finnish Patent Registration Office data. So a whole mix of different kinds of data that allow us to do this analysis, which would not be able to be done in many countries. Now, let me first come to some interesting descriptive statistics. When you look on female-owned versus male-owned firms, the first thing which you can observe is that in female-owned firms, they hire also many more females. So the share of female employees in female-owned firms is much higher than the share of female employees in male-owned firms. We will see this might have an impact when we look into the later results. What we do then in our empirical strategy, also very shortly on this, we use Mincer type wage regressions, typical ODS regressions with and without firm fixed effects. And we start by looking on all firms and then separate by firm owner gender. So we compare female-owned firms with male-owned firms and define female-owned and male-owned firms when there are more than one firm owner. When there's 60% of the firm owners are female or male, then it's female or male-owned firms and vice versa. Coming to the results, we observe a gender pay gap in Finland of 12% without firm fixed effects, a bit more than 11% with firm fixed effects. If the firm is owned by female owners, the wages paid to these is reduced by 3 percentage points, while on the overall employee publication, while in female firms, the wages paid to female employees is 3 percentage points higher than in male firms. Which means, in other words, Female owners pay less overall, but pay more to their firms, to their female employees. In other words, there is a smaller gender pay gap in female-owned firms. And how do they do this? They simply pay lower wages to the males and more or less the same wages to the females, like in male-owned, firms. When we look further down, and now we differentiate between male-owned and female-owned firms, we can confirm these results. There is in female-owned firms a 3 percentage points lower wage gap when compared to male-owned firms and also to firms with unknown business owners, hence larger firms. This holds true for all kinds of wage calculations, hourly wages, the basic model, but also when we incur bonuses, vacation compensations, etc. And the monthly wages, this 3% increase slightly to 4%, 4 percentage points, the difference between male and female-owned firms. Now, the most interesting results, however, can be seen when we differentiate between industries. And when we look on the bottom, on the top of this table, we see in this, let's say, traditional industry, manufacturing sector, so manufacturing, construction, wholesale businesses, we see there is hardly any difference between male and female-owned firms. So female owners in male-dominated businesses do not reduce the gender pay gap. And we see a completely different picture when we look into modern service sectors. Here, take, for instance, ICT, real estate, administrative and support services, or professional, scientific, technical service activities. We observe for female-owned firms basically no or a very small gender pay gap, significantly different from zero, but still very small. So just take, for instance, ICT, where it's really zero. For the male-owned businesses, we still observe a relatively large gender pay gap. It's not as large as in the traditional manufacturing sector, but it remains large. And we see, so to say, that there is a huge differences in these service sector industries when it comes to the gender pay gap in female-owned businesses. They basically really reduce it to zero. There's certainly one more interesting exception from these two rules, so to say, manufacturing and service sectors. In accommodation and food services, the gender pay gap is independent of whether it's male or female-owned, is relatively close to zero. Last slide of results. We also looked into firm sizes, of course. We observed that in smaller firms, female owners are really able to reduce the gender pay gap. So it's 4 percentage points only in small firms, 8 percentage points in small male-owned firms. We observed that the gender pay gap increases the larger the firms, but we also observed that the influence of female-owned firms fades the larger the firms become. In large firms, irrespective of whether it's a male or female-owned businesses, it's relatively similar, around 11 to 12 percentage points. Coming to the conclusion, there is a gender pay gap of 12 to 16% in Finland. Females are able to reduce this gender pay gap by 2 to 3 percentage points in female-owned businesses when we look on hourly wages, and 4 percentage points when we look at monthly wages. And these differences in the pay gap are robust when we look into additional compensation schemes. Most importantly, we find strong industry-related effects in the more traditional male-dominated industries. The gender pay gap is the same, independent of the ownership, of the gender of the ownership. So it looks like female entrepreneurs here need to be one of the team, so they do not differ in their behavior. In the service sectors, we see strong influence of female entrepreneurs on the wage gap. Interesting, like I said before, in these industries, female entrepreneurs also employ more female employees, and this probably that is the mechanism how it works, that the gender pay gap is nearly zero here. So we can conclude part of the gender pay gap might be out to discriminatory practices. Female entrepreneurs are able in small and medium-sized firms to address this part of the gender pay gap, and it might be one more good reason to foster female entrepreneurship. It also means when females run larger firms, they might need to hire like-minded female managers if they want to address this pay gap in a similar way. Thank you. That was it from my side.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for this interesting presentation. If you have a question, please raise your hand and unmute yourself. Maybe I'll get us started. I really found this result about firm size quite striking. And I'm wondering, what might be going on there? Is it that in larger firms, female owners just don't have this day-to-day control or reach to make a difference? Is that might be what might be going on there?
Yeah, that's what we expect, and it would be certainly an interesting further research question. I mean, in the larger firms, they have, of course, then again, managers on the first and second level, and probably they did not look into the gender composition of their managers, because if they had done that, we should have found again, of course, a certain impact on the gender pay gap. But obviously, they hire managers irrespective of the gender, and obviously they lose then the direct influence on the wages paid to the employees, which is, from my point of view, absolutely reasonable to assume, because that's what we know. In large firms, the owner is not anymore in being, let's say, active in the operation of the business as usual.
Yeah, interesting. Questions? Other questions? Well, maybe one more for me. I found it also quite interesting that for most of your results, actually adding the firm fixed effects didn't do much, right? So I'm wondering what's your, I mean, which is great, isn't
Yes.
it?
Yeah,
but
we were happy about that.
Yeah, no, I would be too if I were you. Yeah, it's. I mean, empirically that's great, but I'm wondering, what is going on there?
I mean, basically, it means that what it tells us that within firms, the analysis still, so to say, there is an impact of the female owners on the wages when comparing, so to say, within firms versus between firms in the non-fixed effects approach. That's basically, let's say, a kind of a technical way of explaining it. It at least says that the observed differences in the between firms was not, so to say, by any kind of eaten up by any kind of self-selection processes into the firms. That's at least, so to say, from a positive point of view, the result.
Yeah, I would say, I mean, my interpretation would be there is no firm specific culture that is behind any of this. Maybe another way of
That's true. That's also a way how one can interpret these results.
Yeah, very nice. So if people are interested, I encourage them to read the paper. I will for sure do that since it is of great interest to me. Thank you very much for
thanks
this.
Also from my side. Thanks, very shortly said, thanks very much for the invitation. It was a really great pleasure to present here once more. Thank you.
Wonderful. So we will move to the next presentation by Alena Bičáková. I apologize if I mispronounced your last name. You can pronounce it once for us. So please, you can share your screen and I will start the timer.
Okay. Thank you very much. So you pronounce it perfectly. So thank you for being here. This is a joint work with Kalíšková, in which we are evaluating the impact of a 4-year paid parental leave on future child outcomes. So the type and quality of early childcare has a substantial impact on child development. And there are many papers that show that, and these papers typically use the exogenous variation of or in childcare coming from the changes in family leave policies and also from universal childcare reforms, and the results are mixed. The results are mixed because this effect varies by age of a child, by child background, also by the type of outcomes that we look at. When these outcomes are measured, the results are also mixed because not always the counterfactual childcare like the counterfactual to the one induced by the policy change is certain and typically is heterogeneous. There's also no paper which would actually look at the impact of a more than 3-year paid family leave on long-term child outcomes, because such leaves are just very rare. So here comes our paper, which looks at the impact of maternal care beyond child's 3rd birthday on long-term child outcomes. And what we mean by long-term child outcomes, it's human capital investments and labor market attachment. And we are making use of a reform which took place in the Czech Republic in 1995, which actually extended paid parental leave from 3 to 4 years. And in our previous work with Clara, we showed that this policy change induced almost 40% of mothers of 3-year-old children to stay at home with these children. So the take-up was really substantial. And to give you an idea of what we find already now, we do find a substantial negative impact of this policy on children long-term outcomes, especially on college enrollment and also labor market attachment in the early 20s of these children. And this is especially so for children among low-educated mothers. So to give you an overview of institutional background, this policy took place on the 1st of October of 1995, and it extended the paid parental leave from 3 to 4 years. The monthly benefit, monthly amount remained unchanged, and the job protection, interestingly, remained at 3 years. Now, in terms of eligibility, only children who turned 3 after the 1st of October 1995 were eligible for this extended leave, not the children who turned 3 before. So the cutoff is basically for the 2 cohorts born around October 1st of 1992. And there were 2 very important conditions for the receipt of the allowance for the benefit, and one was that the mother was basically not allowed to work, so there was a limit on income, and also the child was not allowed to be enrolled in formal childcare. Now, formal childcare at that time was basically widely available, financially affordable, because subsidized, public kindergartens, and that was more or less the main alternative to maternal care. So here comes another advantage of the setting that we have here, is that the counterfactual that we see to this extension of maternal care is fairly homogeneous and fairly straightforward. So basically, if this reform didn't take place, these children would have been enrolled in the kindergarten. So let me very briefly show you the take-up of this reform just based on this descriptive statistics. Here we see the share of mothers who are at home with children. The blue line are mothers with 2-year-old children, and we see that all of them are a huge share at home with their children. When we look at children at the age of 4 and 5, we see that much less mothers are at home with them. And when we focus on the orange line, which are the mothers of 3-year-olds, we see a substantial, sharp increase in the share of mothers who stayed at home with these children. So that's basically the take-up. Now, as I said, the major counterfactual for this maternal care was the kindergarten enrollment. So basically, here, the children, the mothers who were working, the children were enrolled in the public kindergarten. And we can see it reflected in this figure, where basically we see a decrease, quite substantial decrease in enrollment in the public kindergartens among the children who are 3-year-old. So the data that we use is a standard labor force survey, which is basically part of the EU LFS. We focus on long-term outcomes. So basically when these children are 21 to 22, so we observe the outcomes in the period 2010 to 2016. This is a standard rotational panel for 5 quarters. So we make use of the rotational panel to determine the age of the child in quarters of the year. And an important note for our heterogeneity analysis, which looks at the impact by mothers' education, we also need information about mothers. However, we have this information only for children who still reside with their mothers at the age of 21 and 22. Hence, that's the choice of the time when we look at these children. They have already finished high school. We can look at the entry to the labor market, but we can also see potential enrollment in college. At that time, about 75% of children still reside with their mother, and we do conduct an analysis which actually looks at the potential selection of our heterogeneity analysis, and fortunately see that actually the reform did not have any impact on the probability of residing with one's mother. Now, we also have an extension in the paper where we try to look at college degree completion, and there we extend our analysis to the age of 27, but that's only for the whole sample. There we can't do the heterogeneity analysis because we don't have enough children residing with their mothers. Okay, in terms of methodology, as is probably quite clear already from the institutional setting, we compare the last cohort, which was not affected by the reform, with the first cohort, which was already affected. These are children born before or after October 1st, 1992, because the cutoff was focused on the age of 3, and it was in 1995. However, these two cohorts, the last unaffected and the first affected, may or do differ in the season of birth, but also depending on when we measure and when we compare their outcomes, whether at the same time or at the same age, they also differ in age, and they also differ in the state of the business cycle. So this is why we basically apply a standard difference in differences framework, where we use two cohorts around a similar cutoff, but 2 years earlier, where there was no reform, as our control groups. Now, an important point is that we don't see the actual take-up. We don't know whether mothers of these children that we observe at the age of 21 or 22 actually did stay at home with them for 4 years. So these are really the intention to treat estimates that we are showing. Okay, here a bit more on methodology, so it's quite clear. So this is the last unaffected. Here are our control groups. This is standard definitive specification, so nothing much to explain here. The parameter of interest, of course, is alpha 3. Now, one thing I can mention at this point already is that we vary the window around the cutoff that we focus on. So when we will look at the results, 3 to 1 will be specification where we only compare cohorts 1 quarter after and 1 quarter before. And we vary that up to the window of 4 quarters. So 3 to 4 will be 4 quarters cohort born 4 quarters afterwards and 4 quarters before. So in terms of the outcome variables, we focus on completed high school. That is not that interesting because a lot of people complete high school. The 2 outcomes to really focus on is tertiary, being enrolled in tertiary education, so basically college, and also the outcome net, so that the standard outcome typically looked at of people not being in education, employment, or training. We also focus on some more specific outcomes like employment, unemployment, inactivity, and also on family outcomes in terms of marital status, fertility, and so on. Okay, so these are the results. So let me guide you through it. First, this is looking at the impact on education. So completed high school, we see there's basically nothing, and a lot of people, over 90% of the sample, into tertiary education, so basically college. So we education. So this is a cohort of 4 quarters affected by the reform versus 4 quarters before. We already see that there is actually a decrease by over 5 percentage points in college enrollment. And when we look at the heterogeneity analysis and explore how do children of low educated and high educated mothers fare, so what we see is that it's all driven by children of low educated mothers, and there the effect is actually twice as large. So it's 12 percentage point decrease in the probability of being enrolled. And also, very interestingly, the effect is basically driven by girls. So this is all driven by daughters, where the effect is even greater. When we move to the results on labor market attachment, again, focusing on this not in employment and education and training outcome, what we see is that even for the overall sample, we see an increase or training by about
Alena, I think
for
there seems to be a connection problem.
less employment. Okay, so this is basically a summary of what I've just said. So let me just move on to the next slide, which is about persistence and degree completion. So the question is, so we found these adverse effects on being enrolled in college and also on being not in employment, education, or training. The question is, and this is at the age of 21 to 22. So the question is, are these effects persistent? And this is why we extend our sample to the ages of up to 27. But as I already mentioned, we can't do the heterogeneity analysis here by mother's education because we don't have that information for enough people. But what we do see is that even for the overall sample, there is a substantial decrease in the probability of being enrolled, of completing a college degree by the age of 27 by about 8 percentage points. And here we actually see this for both women and men as well. So it looks like the impact on human capital investment is really there. It's substantial, it's persistent, and it leads to these children having lower probability of actually having a college degree. When we look at the labor market attachment, we see nothing there. So it looks like the effect on net is basically just short-lived. In terms of the other outcomes, I've already mentioned that it looks like boys are somewhat less likely to be employed. Now, interestingly, there's suggestive evidence that the girls who are net are more likely to do housework. However, despite the fact that they do more housework, we don't see any evidence on the fact that they would actually start a family or be married. So no effect on family outcomes, and also no effect on residing with your mother, and also no effect on outcomes of mothers. So we do a series of robustness checks, including a placebo test, looking at the common trend, assumptions, checking, and so on, but you can see that in the paper. I've went through our main findings already, so let me just conclude with a brief discussion. And the discussion is about the way how we interpret this detrimental effect of maternal care between the ages of 3 and 4 in our paper. And our preferred interpretation is really to link the extension of maternal care to the counterfactual and the suggestive evidence that basically the maternal care at the age of 3 or from 3 to 4 basically crowded out enrollment in public kindergarten. And our results seems to suggest that the maternal care, especially by low-educated mothers, may just not be able to substitute all the benefits of formal childcare in terms of gaining cognitive skills, non-cognitive, but also social interaction skills, stimuli, and readiness to enter school. Interestingly, our results are very similar to the both even in sign to the similar literature which studies an introduction of formal childcare at the age of 3, universal childcare at the age of 3. The magnitudes, even when looking at the same outcomes, the magnitudes are the same, only the sign is opposite, because we are looking at the basically cancellation of formal childcare for kids between 3 and 4. So this is kind of reassuring that this is where the effect comes from. However, we do acknowledge that there may be other mechanisms at play which may explain these adverse effects of this policy, and these may go through negative impact on family outcomes, negative impact on mothers' labor market careers. Of course, expectations, aspirations of the daughters, social norms or gender attitudes may be also affected, which may lead to the increase in housework that we observe. However, we see no evidence of this in our data, and we don't have enough information to test it. So this is really left for future research. Sorry for being too long, and thank you. That's it.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Are there questions? Well, maybe let me get started. Yeah, I find this really very interesting. And I'm wondering whether this depends on the birth order of the children. Well, first of all, I find the results for girls utterly depressing, and the fact that they persist even more so, and that these happen to be also girls who are born to low-educated mothers. Yeah, so this is, yeah, I find that very, yeah, depressing. At the same, and then I'm wondering to what extent this depends on whether the girls are firstborn or secondborn, and whether there's any interaction there with the composition of the children, whether it's a boy and a girl, two girls, etc., and whether they have younger or older siblings.
So unfortunately, as we see these children at the age of 21 to 22, or even later, the problem is that, as I said already, only 75% of them reside with their mother. And we see siblings only if they still reside in that household. So unfortunately, we wouldn't, it may be the case that some of the older children we would not have in the data. We would see some of the younger children. And actually, it is part of our placebo analysis where if we do observe a younger sibling within a window of 3 years, what happens is that the parental leave was only linked to the youngest child. So when the child was 3 in 1995, but there was a younger sibling, the parental leave, the 4-year parental leave already was related to that child. The mother received only one benefit for that child, and the other child was allowed to go to the kindergarten. And it was very reassuring for us to see that the placebo analysis shows that where if we exclude these children where we see the younger sibling, the effect got even stronger.
Mhm.
So this was kind of confirming the impact of the formal childcare, that really the main mechanism goes through the fact that formal childcare was postponed from the age of 3 to the age of 4. But so that was nice, but I do realize that I'm not exactly addressing your question, and I try to explain why we can't, because we don't really. But actually, the gender composition in principle we could look at with the younger sibling. But again, yeah, but we don't observe all the siblings. Yeah.
And what was the political motivation for introducing such a reform in the first place and for such a
That's an extremely interesting question, and actually also makes me mention that this particular study has attracted a lot of media attention in this country as well. So we talked on TV and tried to explain, because of course you have like two big camps. One is convinced that mothers should stay at home with children, ideally until the age of 6, and maternal care is extremely beneficial. The other one says mothers, especially high educated mothers, because there's actually one thing I did not mention, but the take-up didn't differ by education. That was amazing. So it's almost the same for like college educated women as for less educated women. But the whole theme was really taken by the media in a very controversial way, and the title would typically be "Mommy or a Kindergarten," and then like one or the other, and what is better, and what's beneficial. So it brought a lot of discussions. And to answer the question that you had was that actually at that time there was indeed a very big campaign for mothers being at home with children. Now there are two possible, and it was even a media campaign, so maybe that's why the take-up was so high. There are two potential explanations. One is that Czech Republic is a former communist country, and during communism up to 1989, basically work was compulsory in the sense, and unemployment kind of did not exist officially. So women did have, and we still have, very high female labor force participation in this country. So it was very high before, and it may be that some of these women really did have a preference to stay at home with children for a longer time. The other issue is that at that time, basically the whole economy was still kind of restructuring, and I think that the politicians could have worried about unemployment, and by taking these women out of the labor market, they could reduce the unemployment rate. So that's a potential conjecture about why, but this is the political background of this reform. Now, last comment. What's really interesting is that the female labor force participation in this country is still very, very high, comparable across the different countries. But given the family leave, which the 4-year family, the option to take the 4-year family leave was abandoned, or was basically didn't become the policy ceased only last January. So basically here, the 1st of January of this year, this policy was abandoned, this option. However, already in 2008, there was an option that the mothers could choose between 2 and 4 years, so 2, 3, or 4, and then later on even continuously just choose the length. So, but this is here. So interestingly, Czech Republic is a big outlier in terms of mothers' labor force participation for kids between 0 and 3. But besides, so very few mothers still work. But besides that, before women have children and after women get after the children become 6 and go to school, the labor force, these women, like compared to Germany, for example, where they go part-time, these women go back full-time and they all work again. So it's really this big gap, probably a lot of human capital depreciation and so on. Sorry, I took too much time.
Thank you. No, this is all very interesting. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for this paper. So like with the others, I encourage everyone to take a look. Thank you so much for this presentation. Now I'd like to invite our next speaker, which is who is Gökben Aydilek. So please share your screen. Alena, if you could stop sharing.
Okay, so I have to, yeah, now I see it, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is Gökben Aydilek. I'm a postdoc from Istanbul. Let's start the presentation. So the title of our study is The Effect of Prenatal Exposure to Ramadan on Human Capital, Evidence from Turkey. So just to give you a quick preview, we are trying to analyze the effect of prenatal exposure to certain nutritional disruptions on human capital formation. And maternal dietary deficiencies, those malnutritions during pregnancy, carry some endogeneity. So in order to resolve that issue, we use Ramadan, the time of Ramadan, the Islamic holy month of fasting, as a natural experiment to assess the effects of maternal malnourishment on cognition. And by cognition, we use schooling and employment measures of individuals as a proxy, and we compare those outcomes of individuals who are exposed to Ramadan in utero with those who are not exposed to. And we find that men who are exposed to Ramadan in utero in the first trimester or in the third trimester, what I mean by trimester is the 3-month period. So in the first 3 months or in the last 3 months, such an exposure causes a decrease in terms of years of schooling, and it decreases the likelihood of middle school completion, high school completion, and college degree completion. Introduction. The literature suggests that disparities in children's well-being and cognitive and non-cognitive competencies, they arise in the initial periods of life and significantly modify the adulthood outcomes. The previous literature also approximates that around 200 million children below the age of 5 would not be able to reach their whole capacity in the long run due to malnourishment. But these estimates belong to the children who are already born. When we think about the children who were exposed to maternal malnourishment during the prenatal period, that the immensity of that affected population becomes even higher. Also, because the current literature also points out that the prenatal malnourishment has the biggest detrimental impact on health of children, as well as the schooling and employment outcomes. So why is this prenatal environment so very important? So because during pregnancy, the child goes through critical developmental phases during which different tissues and organs of its body are being developed. And in that case, if there is some disruption in terms of nutrition, then that the star organ that should be developed in that period cannot get enough resources to continue on that healthy development path. What I mean by that is, if there is a disruption, then that organ or tissue or the system that should be developed in that period cannot compensate for that in the later periods. Or if it is a vital organ or very vital system, it means that it would deplete the resources from the other tissues that should be developing in the later periods. So overall, it means that nutritional shocks during pregnancy might put the child into a vulnerable position. There is this hypothesis, fetal programming hypothesis, or the fetal origins hypothesis, suggesting that what happens in utero does not stay in utero, but it rather has permanent effects on the offspring. What we can say from this is that the human beings or the living creatures in general, we have a greatest strength of adaptation, adapting to the environments that we are in. Although it might sound quite beneficial from this perspective, it might be quite harmful, especially for this case, because the in utero conditions might not match the outside world conditions. For example, if you're someone who is saying that, oh, I gain weight so easily, even drinking water, or even this conversation about gaining weight makes me gain weight, and it might mean that in that case, that child might be exposed to some sort of malnourishment during pregnancy. So although it is quite beneficial for the child to store the fats at a higher rate during pregnancy, it is not beneficial once the child is born and have lots of abundance of food in front of her. So back to the economics perspective, if we think about the capacity of the child having some production function, layout of production function, we can say that those inputs during the prenatal period and postnatal period cannot compensate for each other. So they are not perfect substitutes. So even though you invest the whole world to that child, if that child has some malnourishment, maternal nutritional deficiencies during pregnancy, that child cannot surpass the capacity level that is set in the prenatal period. So it stresses the importance of investments during prenatal times. So the motivation behind our study is that one of the nutritional shocks during pregnancy is observing the Ramadan. We can also think about it as a form of intermittent fasting. So we can also apply these motivation to the Western world, where skipping meals or simply not wanting to gain weight during pregnancy also shapes individuals' decisions on calorie intake. Or maybe some lower socioeconomic background mothers might not be able to meet the necessary nutritional requirements during pregnancy. So we can also apply this motivation to those studies as well. But the case for that would be, but such cases would be carrying some endogeneity, but employing Ramadan for that actually solves that endogeneity problem, so that we can have some cause and effect analysis in here. During Ramadan, every healthy adult Muslim should fast during daylight hours from sunrise to sunset, but I'm saying it just for the simplicity, because depending on the location of the country and also the policy that is adopted to calculate the timing of fasting differs, and oftentimes it is 2 hours before the sunrise. So the duration of fasting is almost approximately 2 hours longer than the daylight hours. And it stays for 30 days, that fasting period. And in Islam, lunar calendar is used, and it is 10 days shorter than the Gregorian calendar. So it means that the first day of the Ramadan shifts backwards every year around 10 or 11 days, depending on the moon cycle. So if you have to have enough data for capturing the seasonality, the effect of seasonality that Ramadan brings into the analysis. So for a country like Turkey, not located in the equator, duration of fasting varies between 11 to 18 hours. And globally, every year, 60 to 90% of Muslim pregnant women practice fasting, and each year around 30 million Muslim babies get exposed to Ramadan prenatally. And currently, 1.2 billion Muslim population experienced Ramadan in utero to some extent. I would like to just briefly mention about the Ramadan culture. People have to fast from between sunrise to sunset, and they are not allowed to eat or consume anything during that time. And while breaking their fast, they enjoy the traditional foods and sweets with the family. So it's quite a social praying method. And in the Holy Book of Islam, it is well defined that the sick people, elderly people, or traveling people, or women who are on their periods, they are exempt from fasting. But they have to make up for those days once their health allows them to do so. But for pregnant or breastfeeding women, the issue is quite vague. There is no information on that, so it is subject to some commentation, if I may say. But also those pregnant women have to make up for these days later on if they opt for not fasting. The motivation for fasting among pregnant women can be summarized as their thought about pregnancy not being an illness. They also feel obliged to fast, and they also find some spiritual relief because it's a method of praying, and they feel healthy enough to practice fasting during pregnancy, and they also fear of compensating alone later on. And also they are afraid of compensating once they start breastfeeding, because fasting for prolonged periods might harm the breastfeeding periods. And they also feel some social pressure as if they are not religious enough. They are afraid that people might see them as not religious as they want them to be so. In addition, even if they do not observe Ramadan, their sleep patterns or nutritional intake might change during that month. So overall, all these changes might affect the development of the fetus, hence form its future. The data set that I used for this study is the Turkish Family Structure Survey from 2016. And around 17,000 people that we have in our sample with equal share of females and males. And I do take the individuals above the age of 32 due to some policy changes in Turkey in terms of education. And the age ranges from 32 to 100 for those individuals in our sample. In our methodology, we thought that every mother had a healthy 9-month gestation period, and we created the exposure times based on the trimester timelines. And we created those 3 trimester stamps for the individuals. And we used intent to treat method. We do not know whose mother actually observed Ramadan, but we are treating everyone whose pregnancy overlapped with Ramadan as exposed to Ramadan. In that case, preterm deliveries cannot be miscategorized as not exposed, but can only be miscategorized as exposed, so that our findings could only be an underestimation of the real effect, not an overestimation. What I mean by that, you can see it from here. There is only 2 months of a period for someone to be not exposed to Ramadan, so that person should be conceived in that very short time period for not being affected by Ramadan. And in here you can see that, suppose the person who is born around February, let's say February 1977, if we miscategorize that person as having some complete pregnancy period, but rather that the person was born at the month of 7, let's say, we could only show that person as exposed rather than not exposed. You can see it here, so that's why ITT is just an underestimation, not an overestimation of the real impact. And we generate 2 types of exposure variables. The first one is the simple overlap between Ramadan and pregnancy by using dummy variables, which is the common methodology in the very limited Ramadan literature. And the second one is duration of fasting, which I'm opting for. And the reason for that is accelerated starvation, because for pregnant women, even 2 hours of skipping a meal could disrupt the biomarkers of that women, and also it might increase the ketone levels, which is quite harmful for the baby. So for a country with the fasting duration time ranging between 11 to 18 hours, I thought that someone who is fasting on a summer season might have different impacts than someone who's fasting on winter season. For the brevity of time, I'm skipping this part, the details. So I didn't want to sum up the whole exposure time, because in that case, someone who is being exposed to Ramadan in the first trimester, let's say for 20 days in winter season with 9 hours of fasting, so in total it makes 180 hours of fasting, would be equal to someone who's exposed to fasting in a summer season for 10 days. So those 180 hours of fasting in total would be equal if I am to summarize sum up all the hours of fasting. But although it might make sense and it might make the analysis quite simple in such a case, from a biological perspective, it could never be the same, since we are talking about accelerated starvation as the starting point. So what I did was that, taking the 15th day of exposure and calculating the total minutes of exposure for that relevant to Ramadan time, and dividing it to the potential fasting day, which has the maximum minutes of fasting. So index of 1 means that Ramadan overlapped the summer season. So the analysis that we use is first using hours exposed. Instead of identifying the exposure trimester, we just checked whether the pregnancy overlapped with Ramadan or not. And in the second one, we used the trimester-specific measures. We included age, sex of the individual, birth month fixed effects, and also individual's mother tongue, place the individual has lived till the age of 15, regional effects, and the cohort effects. We also controlled for gender and included error terms as well. So here I wanted to check whether there is a difference between males and females in terms of their vulnerability to Ramadan. And you can see that the interaction variable with the male exposure it stands out quite much. So I ran the regression separately for females and males, and we see here that we can only see the negative effect for males, significant negative effect for males who are exposed to Ramadan in the first or third trimester. And you can see the coefficient plots as well. While there is no effect for females, we see a significantly negative effect for males. And since we're running multiple time, we wanted to correct it with the Roman and Wolf methods as well, and our results remain robust to that estimation as well. So the conclusion. Our findings implies that the prenatal exposure to Ramadan on the first or third trimester has persistent effect on individuals, especially for males. So the simple interventions such as informing the public that fasting or skipping breakfast or meals during pregnancy has long-term and detrimental effects on the cognitive abilities of their children might change the well-being of the whole society easily, or supporting the lower socioeconomic socioeconomic class during pregnancy might also help them to get rid of that vicious cycle of poverty. And also little prenatal investments might be more cost effective than the traditional and late educational interventions to create more qualified human capital. So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. We already have a question. Alena, please.
So my question is, do you have any interpretation why boys in the uterus are affected and girls are not? Then a second question, but I think you've probably already showed us some information on that, but do you expect the timing of pregnancy to be entirely exogenous to the timing of Ramadan? It may be the case that women actually do plan their childbirth accordingly, not to starve during pregnancy, especially, I'd say, the higher educated women or whatever. Yeah, but thank you. Very fascinating presentation. I like it.
Thank you so much for the questions. Actually, the first question, I was expecting it and I prepared it for the Q&A. The gender effects comes from the differences, biological differences between male and female children. The first one, I mean, there are two hypotheses to explain this. The first one comes from the chromosome differences, XX and XY. The XX belongs to females and XY belongs to males, and Y chromosome carries quite few information compared to the X chromosome. So there is this space for optimization for the females. Suppose that X chromosome carries the information for kidneys, let's say, and the X chromosome coming from the mother has lower quality kidney, let's assume, but that fetus has the option to choose the better one, so that she can have the kidney from the father. But for boys, it is not the case, because that's the only chromosome that he could get the kidney from. So if it's a bad one, it's a bad one. So there is no place for optimization. So it means that if there is a problem, if there is some shortage or anything, then the boy does not have a place to move around or play with the resources. But girls do have some space for that. And also, the boys, the male fetuses, they are much bigger than the female fetuses compared to comparing the whole duration of pregnancy. So it means that they require more resources to feel better, to feel better and get into that the healthy development path. So if there is any shortage in terms of nutrition, then it means that it would hit harder to the boys, and while girls can survive in that condition. For the second question, I did not have data to check for, but the previous literature suggests that the previous literature couldn't find any the timing of pregnancy change according to Ramadan. And also looking at people who are above the age of 30 in 2016. So I'm not sure if there were enough awareness for calculating that timing of pregnancy.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions or comments? And how does, I mean, I know the paper, so I don't want to say too much about it, but in general, maybe you can just mention how this fits with the broader literature that has also looked at the impacts of Ramadan on long-term outcomes.
The previous literature, the limited previous literature, often focuses on either the postnatal period, but for the babies who are just recently born, or they focus on in terms of health aspects of individuals. And they find that even though sometimes we cannot find much of an impact once the baby was born, those fetal programming might kick on after reproductive age hits. So after the age of 45, some people might start having some problems such as asthma or some heart diseases or obesity and so on. So fetal programming does exist, and it might kick on later on. And also, if I'm not mistaken, Karimi and Basu also found some negative effects for the boys while calculating the effect of Ramadan exposure on the height of the children. So they also found some negative impact on boys, but not for girls. So apparently boys need more care during pregnancy. I mean, I could say so.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Are there any further questions or comments? Well, like with all of the other papers, I encourage you to read this very interesting paper, and thank you so much for sharing it with us today. Thank you.
Thank you for having me. Thank you for the invitation.
Great. Then we have, last but not least, António Melo. So we went actually from childcare to pregnancy, and now we're going to abortion. It's an interesting progression or regression. I'm not entirely sure. So please take it away.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Can you? I have to expand the screen. Can you see my PDF?
Yeah, we can see it if you can make it.
But it's not full.
Yeah.
Okay, now it's full screen, I think.
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, no, so first of all, thank you very much for organizing this event, and it's a pleasure to to present my papers. It's entitled "Do All Roads Lead to the Same Destination? Proximity to Abortion Providers, Abortions and Their Conditions in Portugal." And so the question that this paper focuses on is geography a relevant dimension of access to abortion services? And if you ask this to both pro-life or pro-choice advocates, they will surely say yes. We can see this from the recent legal developments, for example, in the US, where more conservative states impose restrictions on women's interstate travel to get an abortion, while more liberal states implement legislation to protect women who come to that state to have an abortion. So yes, it appears that this at least it plays a role in the policy debate. So I'm exploring a country that is very different from the US, by the way, both in terms of scale and institutional setting. However, even in a country of the size of Portugal, proximity to abortion care matters. And it matters because not only it affects the probability with which women abort, but also the conditions in which they abort. So in a nutshell, I find that regions that become farther away from an abortion provider experience fewer abortions, and that women living in those regions experience different abortion conditions. Namely, they are more likely to abort later and to have a surgical abortion. Now, in principle, how does abortion access affect the abortion rates? So in principle, hindered access should lead to a reduction of abortion rates through two mechanisms. So first, pregnant women who face an increase in the cost of abortion may no longer be able to afford it, and so they give birth instead. This leads to fewer abortions, but also women might increase their contraceptive effort in response to decreasing levels of access. So this would lead to fewer pregnancies and to fewer abortions. Now, besides the possibly affecting the ability with which women perform an abortion, or the conditions and or the contraceptive effort that they exert, abortion access might also affect the conditions under which these abortions occur. So take a woman, for example, whose nearest abortion provider closes. Now she'll need more time to organize for a longer trip, perhaps taking some days off of work, and of course this can generate a delay in her access to abortion. And these delays have repercussions on the remaining of the abortion process. Namely, these delays can affect the type of provider these women abort at, because public hospitals, they are chronically short of non-conscient objecting doctors, and so it might be challenging for them to accommodate women who arrive at a late gestational age, and so they might refer them to private clinics who most predominantly use the surgical method. But also, these delays can also affect more directly the method that is used, because after the 9th week of pregnancy, the medical method, so the pill, loses efficiency, and the recommended method in Portugal for the years that I'm analyzing was to do surgeries after the 9th week. So there is room to investigate. What has the previous literature found? So papers exploiting natural experiments in the US have documented a negative impact of distance to an abortion provider on abortion rates. This is quite solid, this evidence. Regarding conditions, there is a paper that looks at the effects of distance to abortion providers on timings, but the results are unclear. So my contribution is, there are two main contributions. So first, this is among the first studies outside the US that examines how access to abortion affects abortion rates, and specifically the first that looks at distance and proximity to abortion care specifically. And this is important because, unlike the US, Portugal has a very different, it has a universal healthcare system where abortions are available free of charge. So in a sense, the major cost, the only cost, or the major cost, let's say, to get an abortion is really the cost to get to an abortion provider. Second, I exploit a rich administrative data set that allows me to make an in-depth analysis of how abortion access affects abortion conditions. So, as I mentioned, there is one paper who looked at timings, but I'm really able to track women from the moment they access to abortion providers to the moment they abort. So I know how many days they waited, the type of provider they accessed and aborted at, and the type of method that they went through. So just to provide a bit of institutional background, abortion was legalized in Portugal in 2007. It was made available through the National Health Service, free of charge, and the intent was to reach as many women as possible. Now, there is an issue, which is the law also established that doctors could conscientiously object to perform abortions. So this creates a conflict between the right of women to have an abortion in a public hospital, because all public hospitals with a maternity should provide an abortion service, but at the same time, they might not have the means to do it if all doctors object to perform abortions. And this is actually the source of variation in the opening status of hospitals that I will exploit. So as I said, I use administrative data on abortions, also on births. So this constitutes, so I build a data set on the universe of pregnancies in Portugal. And I exploit variations in travel time from the municipality of residence of women to the nearest abortion provider. So just to provide a quick view, we can see here from 2008 to 2016, which is the period I'm analyzing, that, for example, in 2011, this abortion provider closed, and so the surrounding municipalities became over 1 hour away from their nearest abortion provider. 2014 here in the northeast, similar situation occurred. So this is the variation that I'm exploiting. So what will I do? I will estimate this regression. I'll regress an outcome that relates to abortion rates or to abortion conditions on a proxy of proximity to abortion care, which is the travel time by car from the municipality of residence to the abortion provider. And of course, I introduce some, depending on the specification, municipal level and individual level controls, municipality fixed effects, and time fixed effects. Of course, there is an issue, which is this is a two-way fixed effect model, and when treatment timing varies, the new diff in diff literature shows that this can lead to biases. So this is why I estimate this using a stacked diff in diff. For the sake of time, I will skip how I built the stacks, but that's what is used. I assume that variation in travel time to the nearest abortion provider is as good as random. And the main argument why this is the case is because, as I said, a hospital that has only one or two non-conscientious objecting doctors, if one leaves, this hospital cannot provide any more an abortion service, because you need at least two non-conscientious objectors to have a service running. So these variations in teams, in hospital teams, it's going to define whether the whether the hospital has an abortion service or not. And this is a shock in supply that is not related to abortion demand, because that's one of the threats would be that actually supply is just responding to demand. We do some checks, some robustness checks, and we see that the abortion rates on the catchment area of abortion providers are quite stable before both openings and closures. So I have 5 minutes. I will skip the other identification threats, but so we also check for whether there is a omitted variable bias, so whether social norms also affect both supply and abortion demand at the same time. This does not appear to be the case. And also that women do not sort geographically closer to abortion providers depending on their likelihood of having an abortion. This is unlikely. These hospitals have other services that women, regardless of their probability of having an abortion, would still need to use the hospital. So this is a section that I devote to that. So what are my findings? I find that regions that become farther away experience a reduction in the number of abortions, particularly that municipalities that become over 1 hour away experience a reduction of their abortion rate by 22%. And the abortion ratio, that is the number of abortions over pregnancies, also reduces by a similar amount, so 23%. Regarding abortion conditions, I find that women who live farther away, they arrive later at abortion services, and that they are more likely also to be referred from a public provider to a private clinic for the reasons. So I argue that this is for these reasons that I've said before, that it might be challenging for these hospitals to accommodate these women that are arriving at later and later gestational ages. Also, these women are at a higher risk of having a surgical abortion. Specifically, women living over 1 hour away from a provider are almost 180% more likely to have a surgical abortion than those who live within 30 minutes of an abortion provider. In conclusion, abortion access affects both abortion rates and abortion conditions. One exercise I also do in the paper is to try to estimate what if the NHS would have been expanded to reach all women in Portugal to make them within 30 minutes of an abortion provider. What would be the gains, given that these referrals from public to private hospitals cost money, and actually these private clinics, they use the more costly surgical methods. So it costs around 100 euros more than the medical method. And so if this expansion would have been done, would there be any savings? And my findings are that the savings would be quite limited. Nevertheless, I would like to stress that this would allow women to have a higher level of choice on the method that they would use, because when they are far away, basically they are restricted to the choice of having a surgical abortion. This is the paper, and so I would like to thank you for your time, and I can go more into detail to parts of this paper if you have any questions. So thank you once again very much for this initiative, and it was a pleasure.
Thank you very much for this interesting presentation. Who would like to ask a question? Well, I have several, but maybe let me just start with a clarification question. I didn't understand why in a hospital a doctor or a team of doctors can refuse to perform the abortion procedure.
Yes, so it's a legal status that they can claim, which is that they are ethically or morally opposed. They morally oppose abortion, and they don't want to be involved in this practice. Portugal is, it's only legalized abortion in 2007, and so that it is a conservative country to some extent, and many doctors, like 65% of doctors, are conscientious objectors, and of course, depending on how they are distributed across the country, this can really make a big difference. That some hospital, and there is a recent report that I quote in the paper, shows that all hospitals that don't have an abortion services because they don't have doctors who are not objecting to perform abortions. And including, which was interesting, because this information was not available. There was no, during the period of the analysis, it was only, because this actually also got some media attention recently, this question of conscientious objection and how it really limits access of women who are in more rural areas, for example. And And so this raised a lot of awareness, and so this triggered this report, this audit that was done on hospitals to really understand how many conscientious objectors there is and what are the difficulties. And so some of the hospitals that closed during this period, they show up in this report, and it's clearly the case that they don't have any non-conscientious objectors working. So it's this variation. So just having one less non-conscientious objector can make a very big change in how the service is organized.
Yeah, yeah. I would like to give the floor to Alena to ask a question.
Just a quick question about the way how the distance in time is measured. Did you take into account the public transportation versus is this taking car? And in general, I find it actually incredibly surprising that it matters so much, like 1 hour drive. I do imagine that this is an important, I mean, you have to find the time during the day, you kind of postpone or whatever, but it's really interesting. So, but the question was really the way this is measured and whether this could bring in some more variation.
Yes, so it is the by car. It's the distance, the travel time by car, which I think correlates also a lot with the travel time by public transports. And indeed, in Portugal, most commutes are done by car. So around, if my numbers are not incorrect, around 90% of commutes are done by car. So car is really the main means of transportation in Portugal. So I think it's the most relevant. But it's true that yeah, public transportation is not taken into account. But I believe it's strongly correlated. And regarding your point, so was on the distance, how it was measured, and whether 1 hour makes a difference. So it makes a difference. Also, I didn't go into the details, but you need to have a 3-day waiting period between the first appointment and the abortion procedure itself. So you're already going outside of your town. You have to do this appointment. You have to come back to do the abortion procedure. Depending on surgery, usually you can get out of the hospital if you go in the morning, in the afternoon. It might not be the case. So it does require some organizational effort that is very different from just commuting 10 minutes or 20 minutes to within your city. So and I guess, yeah, it seems like a small distance, but depending on women's situation, and it can be hard to arrange this trip.
Okay, thank you. I don't want to take time of others, but is there any heterogeneity? I mean, do you see any differences of the impact across women with different socioeconomic status?
It's true that there is not. There is not. It's a good point. I didn't check these conditions and by heterogeneity. No, didn't do that analysis. Yeah. But it's a good point. It's an interesting.
Yeah, it was. I had a similar thought. Does it shift essentially the composition of women who, given the higher cost of this, if travel time is a cost, which it is, yeah, if you have a different, yeah, socioeconomic background of women who are more likely to do this. And then I was wondering also about shifts into at-home medication, etc. Since you were talking about abortions within the first 10 weeks, so that's pretty early in a pregnancy, and then you can have a substitute for that through medication, for example, to induce an abortion at home. So I'm wondering whether there is any substitution going there.
So I think it's even for the medication, you still need to go to the clinic. It's true that you can then bring the pill, but you still have to go there. You cannot get it in a pharmacy. It's still a bit restrictive. The way I think that's actually one very good pathway that should be taken, which these are not technically challenging procedures, and particularly as you said, 10 weeks. Portugal has one of the lowest gestational age limits in Europe.
Very early.
It's only until 10 weeks, but but from a point of view of is it technically challenging? It's not. It could be done through primary care, and it could be done at home. I think it's the time to rethink the structure of this law. It's been going on for 15 years, and I think there is some awareness regarding the conscientious objecting issue, and I think this is clearly a way to provide access, because otherwise it's really creating just a geographical discrepancy in access that is not, in my eyes, justifiable. And regarding your other point, yes, as I said, I think there's probably some heterogeneity going on, absolutely, and yeah, it is an interesting thing that I can explore further. That's true.
Well, thank you very much for all of the interesting presentations. Thank you to all authors and the audience. Thanks of all to Klaus Timmermann, the editor-in-chief of the journal Population Economics, who is the mastermind behind all of these events. And we have these events regularly, so hopefully see you again. And have a nice rest of the evening or afternoon, wherever you are in the world. Thank you.